Okay, here we are, ready. We were just a little bit late getting started tonight, and I want to apologize to you, Gary, our green person. Is that Gary? Yes, that's Gary. Okay. We're glad you're here. Looks like Jonathan's not here tonight, or we're not in contact with him yet. Tonight is our week 4. Tonight is week 4, and we're going to look at the First Crusade tonight. Okay, and I'm just looking at the syllabus for a minute to sort of get our bearings here on where we are. I left myself a little bit of leeway here, thinking that we might take a bit longer with the First Crusade, and so that next week the topics are quite vague in case I need to catch up and insert some other stuff. I have a massive amount of stuff to do tonight on the First Crusade, and we may not get all the way through it all. So we'll just see how it goes, because I do want you to ask questions. I want you to comment on your reading, because at this point tonight you should have finished up reading Fulcher of Chartres and our book of sources on the First Crusade. So I'd really, like you all to make comments as we go through the First Crusade about the sources you've read about, and I'll try to remember to make comments as well when we go through the First Crusade. Also, we have 2 more meetings before the midterm, right? And I do have a review sheet for the midterm that has lists of names, dates, places, events. Actually, several hundred. It might scare you when you see it. But they're really important ones. I mean, it's the obvious names and dates and places on the list. They're the very obvious ones. And also some questions. And I think I have 10 questions on that review sheet, and I will give you a choice of 3 of those questions on the midterm. So you'll have the questions at least a week in advance to look at and mull over. And I believe Joni said she was going to do a review section, and so we'll have that information on the website this week for you to download that. I do have the notes for tonight's lecture. I got those on the website. I'm sorry I didn't get them on until 4 o'clock, but they're on there now. Okay, and now you need, for the next 2 weeks, there's just a light reading assignment in the Arab Historians of the Crusades, and you need to be getting together your prospectus for your paper. Okay, and you all know my phone number and my email and Joni's email in case you have any questions and you need help on that, okay, for your prospectus. So you need to kind of concentrate on that. Okay, that orients us with the syllabus. Now let's turn to the First Crusade, and I had a couple of comments about last week. We had our really wonderful visitors who gave us an insight into the Muslim religion. I promised you I would show you an Oriental rug here, which is a this is really interesting because virtually everything to do with Islam is a reference to paradise. When you go inside the mosque, the columns inside the mosque are palm trees to recall the paradise. There are flowers on the floor. Persian rugs like this one are the representation of a garden. And remember that paradise is a garden and an oasis in the desert, which is a particularly Arabic conception of heaven. So here's a lovely Persian rug that you can see. And this is not copyrighted. It's on my son's living room floor. Okay. We also looked at some Muslim architecture, and this is the Mosque of Cordoba in Spain, showing some more of that Muslim architecture. And you can see how it's quite similar to medieval architecture in Europe. They do influence each other, and we'll see more of that. And as Spain was reconquered, here is a view of the Cathedral of Cordoba, and notice the Islamic architecture is a major feature of that Christian cathedral in Cordoba. I wanted to recall to you the heights of achievement that Islam had reached by essentially the 11th century, which is just the century before, or leading up to the First Crusade, is when they reached their height of cultural development. And in astronomy, they were they were unsurpassed in their discovery of new stars and their naming of all the stars. In mathematics, they had all the Greek literature to fall back on, all the Greek learning, which was absent in the West at that time. And here are some astronomical, what are they called? Constellations, thank you. And so here are the stars that show these constellations, Perseus and Andromeda. These are Greek, of course, but the Muslims did discover a lot of those constellations. And this is a kind of interesting picture I found. It's the coronation of the great Khan. This would have been the Mongols who, as you recall, came in toward during the crusading era. The Mongols came in and conquered Islam, which really traumatized a lot of the Muslims. I'm going to suggest tonight that the Crusades also introduced a bit of trauma into the Muslim lands, and I'll kind of end with that. Okay, I wanted to maybe we could wait for this lecture for a moment, but I wanted to make a couple of comments about our visitors last week who really did a wonderful job, I think, of giving us insights into the spiritual nature of Islam. And a couple of things that we might want to recall is that Islam is a way of life, which is one of the things they stress, that it is not just a religion, but religion and the state and the law and the education, everything is bound up in the Quran. It's all one package. I mean, you don't just buy into the religion, you buy into a whole system. And so that's a really important thing to know about Islam. And I think last week we saw a very shining spirituality that is indeed a part of Islam. Nevertheless, there are some darker sides to Islam, as there are to Christianity, and we've had some more suicide bombers this week. There is a fervor for the religion that is shared by other religions beside Islam, and we're going to see some of that in Christianity today. So Islam is not immune to it, neither is Christianity, but they're all part of what is called the true believer. I don't know if you're aware of an older book by Eric Hoffer called The True Believer that examines the psyche of people who become very engrossed in their religion and become very devoted to it. The true believer is what it implies, that someone who is throwing themselves wholeheartedly into a religion or a cause of any kind. And it's a very interesting book to look at how people are. And there are some Muslims today who are in that mode, just as there were Christians during the Crusade who were in that mode. And we're going to look at some of those today. Anybody have any comments or about our visitors last week? I think it went very well. You all asked some good questions too. Okay. Well, if you think of anything as we go along, you can ask questions. Okay, now we'll go to the First Crusade. Everything has been leading up to the First Crusade. On November 27th in 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II called the First Crusade. And as you recall, he had his journey through France, and he had wound around. He visited Adhemar de la Puy. He visited Ramond of St. Giles or Ramond of Toulouse. He's called both of those things. And he set it up. You know, he didn't just walk out and just at the spur of the moment call the crusade. He prepared the ground very carefully, and there was a lot of background to that crusade, that call to crusade. Oh, okay, Jonathan's here. Hi, Jonathan. We see you. Okay. Okay, so Urban called the First Crusade, and the crowd responded, "God wills it." Now, the crowd didn't know that he had prepared for this, but Ramond of St. Giles, who he had visited, was the first to step forward and say, I'm going. And he had already set that up with Raymond of St. Giles before he left. And from the Council of Clermont, bishops and preachers were sent out to spread the word all over northern France. And part of the message that they were spreading was taken from the Bible, two particular verses from the Bible, both from Matthew. One is, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. So that's where taking the cross comes up. The shorthand for that verse is take the cross. And later on, a couple of hundred years later, the word crusade evolves out of that. And the second verse that they used was, and everyone that hath forsaken houses or brethren or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my name's sake shall receive 100-fold and shall inherit everlasting life. Now, can you see in the heart of that quote where the dispensations come from? The forgiveness of sins, if you go on crusade, your sins are forgiven, and you will inherit everlasting life. So there's biblical evidence, biblical foundations for the gist of what they were promised on the Crusades. And here to remind you of Urban's route through France, that he started over here. He actually started in Rome. He went all this way, and first he went here, and here's Clermont, and then he went all around preaching the Crusades. And so, he didn't just do it out of the blue with no preparation. Here is a plan of Clermont as it looked later, so you can see the city of Clermont where he preached this crusade in the cathedral. Yes, do you have a question?
Yes, just going on what you were talking about with the verses. In reading, I believe it's the Fulcher of Chartist writings.
Yes.
Every time he had the chance and opportunity, he would bring scripture into the places they were going, and the events that were taking place. He tied those into a scripture, in his writings. I noticed that pretty much throughout the whole thing.
Excellent. I'm glad you noticed that, because they were always looking for biblical foundations for everything they did. And so that's very good. At least the editor has gone in and identified those verses, but medieval people knew the Bible so well that they didn't have to quote, say this is Matthew 16. Everybody recognized a biblical quote when they heard it. But I'm so glad you recognized that, because that is typical of all the writings of the Middle Ages. I mean, that's just their style in which they wrote. Okay, good. Here is a preacher. He's somewhat later, but we can think of maybe this is how Peter the Hermit might have looked as he went out and harangued the crowds as he spread the word, and he became the most popular preacher of the First Crusade. They also pictured themselves as vassals of Christendom, and they pictured Christ as their feudal lord. We spent a lot of time in our background looking at feudalism and the way this feudal system was the way they had organized their society as both a military and a social and a political system that dominated the whole society. And so it's not surprising that they think of God in the same way as their feudal lord, and they think of themselves as vassals of Christendom. And they're often pictured as pilgrims and taking a pilgrim's vows, because, of course, the word crusade was not invented for a couple of centuries. They didn't think they were doing anything new. In fact, they thought they were carrying on the same old, they were carrying on traditions. And this is such a tradition-bound society that they always think of themselves as doing traditional things. They never think of doing something new, because newness was not valued in this society. Following the past was valued. So their pattern to follow was as pilgrims. And so they're going on a pilgrimage, and they're going to take pilgrims' vows. And interestingly, if you go back and you try to track pilgrimage in the past, it's really the 9th and 10th century and the 11th century, the early 11th century, where pilgrimage gets really big. And pilgrims are groups are going to Jerusalem, groups are going to St. James at Compostela, which is in northern Spain, and that's where they thought St. James had gone and had died there. To Rome, pilgrims go to Rome, and usually they go in groups with armed escorts because there are lots of bandits on the road, and so an armed pilgrimage is not something new. What is new is that they're sent to actually use their arms to recapture the Holy Land. That's new, but the rest of it is not new. There are other precedents for holy wars. Okay, here Urban is calling a holy war, but we have precedents for that. The Reconquest in Spain began in the 1030s, and you had a lot of people fighting in Spain, fighting the Muslims and pushing them farther and farther south. The fall of Toledo in 1085 was just 10 years before the crusade, and Toledo is right smack in the center of Spain. And so they had pushed that border down to the middle of Spain. They had reconquered half of Spain already. So holy war had been going on in Spain for almost 100 years. The Treaty of Melfi in 1059 was between Pope Nicholas II and Robert Guiscard and Richard of Salerno, and what happened was the Pope for the first time became a feudal lord himself. He saw himself as a feudal lord and these Normans in Italy as his vassals, and he actually gave to Robert Guiscard a papal banner to conquer Sicily, which was Muslim at the time. And so here's a holy war that's 30 or 40 years before the crusade was called. Pope Nicholas then takes the Normans in Italy as his feudal vassals, and then another 20 or 30, actually 30 years before the First Crusade, William the Conqueror was given the papal banner by Pope Alexander II to conquer England. And so it's kind of a holy war in a way. England is a somewhat different case. That's a very interesting problem, whether William the Conqueror and Pope Alexander thought of England as an infidel land. There's a possibility he did, but we'll talk about that another time. But here is the papal banner given to conquer a land, and saying that God is on our side, and that the Pope is acknowledging the right to conquer England. We also might recall the Song of Roland, where Roland is attacked by the Muslims, or they're called Saracens at the Battle of Roncesvalles, and which is right on the border of Spain and France. And the incident is a rear guard attack as Charlemagne's troops were leaving France, but the legend was quite different. The legend made it a pitched battle between Muslims and Christians, and it showed the Christians as, it's a holy religious battle. And interestingly, the very first time the Song of Roland appears in history is that the Normans are reputed to have sung it going into the Norman conquest of England, going into the Battle of Hastings. It's the first time we hear a mention of the Song of Roland, and the first people who wrote it down, it was oral literature before, the first people who wrote it down were the Normans in England. And so, the timing there is contemporary to the Crusades, where they have this consciousness of that battle, and they're shaping the history of it. Also, there are legends that Charlemagne actually conquered Jerusalem, and here's a picture of Charlemagne conquering Jerusalem. And it's not true, but there are legends that he conquered Jerusalem as a great conqueror. And here is another legend that shows Charlemagne as being crowned emperor in Jerusalem. So there's a strong feeling that Jerusalem is a Christian city and belongs to the Christian emperors. So that's kind of the background that we have to going on this crusade. In the 1070s and 1090s, Pope Gregory VII sought homage as feudal lord from the kings of Europe. So the popes think of themselves as feudal lords. He actually received homage from the kings of Denmark and Aragon and Hungary. He asked for it from England, but William the Conqueror did not give it to him. But recall Gregory's glorification of the Miles Christi, the knight who fights for Christ, the sanctification of lay society, and the idea that the lay vocation can be like the monk's vocation. You can be as holy as a monk if you fight for Christ, if you carry out your knightly vocation for the sake of Christ. And remember the old Benedictine rule, the idea that monks have to work is to pray? Well, the idea is a knight's work is to fight, and this kind of fighting on behalf of Christ is like prayer. It's like the sanctification of the knightly vocation. It has been established that some 150,000 Europeans responded to the first call for crusade. Probably half of them died, most of them on the way there. And these pilgrims departed from Europe in waves. They didn't go all at one time, but they went wave after wave after wave. And I'm following Jonathan Riley Smith here, who roughly divided them into 3 waves, although there were actually more than 3 waves, 3 big waves and lots of small waves in between, okay? And here we have an imaginary election of St. Peter as Pope, which the papacy at this time is stressing the power of St. Peter and themselves as a representative of St. Peter on earth. So the power of the papacy is bound up in this, and here we have a sort of the knightly vocation, and this is shown in the legendary story of Alexander who fought the dragon, and so the glorification of the knight. Okay, the first wave was the People's Crusade, and that was led by Peter the Hermit, and he was a ragtag charismatic preacher. He was sort of a monk, and he went around in rags, but he was a brilliant speaker, and he inspired people, and he went all through northern France and he preached the crusade. He appealed mostly to the common people and some of the lesser nobility. It was the great nobles who listened to Pope Urban. It was the lesser nobles who were rather poor, and maybe they were only just a knight, and a lot of common people, the common folk, followed, just dropped everything they had and followed Peter the Hermit on his journey as he went. He went through northern France, and I'll show you on a map in a minute. In April 1096, he arrived at Cologne, and he had a bunch of lesser nobility in his entourage. I have the names here. You don't have to remember these. Just remember the main crusaders. But I'm going to mention these guys again. This is a mistake. We shouldn't have that N on there. Count Hugh of Tübingen, Count Henry of Schwarzenberg, and Walter of Teck, and the 3 sons of the Count of Zimmern, and these are the lesser nobility, mostly from Lorraine. Here are some common people, and these are on carvings that are on church pews of common people, which is a wonderful place to see what the common people look like. These are shoemakers, and so you can see what the common people might have looked like. On Easter Tuesday, Walter Sansavoir, who was also following Peter the Hermit, broke away from Peter's movement and set out for Hungary. Okay, Walter went up the Rhine and down the Danube, and he reached Hungary on the 8th of May. When he got to Hungary, he asked King Koloman for permission to cross the kingdom, and King Koloman of Hungary agreed, and so he crossed without incident. He reached Belgrade, and this would be just crossing into Greece, and the Byzantines were there. They were in control, and the Byzantine commander was taken by surprise. Now, by the time Walter Sansavoir had reached Belgrade, he had run out of food, so he demanded food, and when the Byzantine commander made no response, he pillaged the countryside with his followers. At Semlin, 16 followers were captured, and their arms were taken away from them, and the people of Semlin sent them naked across the river. Okay, we see a beginning of problems. I wanted to show you here some interesting things. Here I have a map of the Roman world, this is dated 1119, which is just about the time of the First Crusade, and so you can see how crude their knowledge of geography is. This is from Ptolemy's geography, his map of the Roman world. I mean, they really have no idea what a map is like. And this is a map of the island of Sardinia. And you see, this again is 12th century. This is a Greek map, and the Greeks are a little better at map making, but they really don't know where they're going, and they don't know how to get there. I mean, they're going out into the wilderness, really. Here is a fragment of a map of Gaul, and this one is actually 13th century. It follows the way some of the Roman maps did, which shows actual houses and buildings and maybe the roads along the way. And they don't really have a lot of guidance here. They're just getting on their horse and going, especially the followers of Peter the Hermit. I mean, they really don't know where they're going. And here I've tried to map out Peter the Hermit's route. As far as I could figure out from the description I had, he basically goes through across northern France, preaching all the way and picking up followers, and then he ends up in Cologne, and then he stays there a while. Walter Sansevoire breaks off from him and goes up the Rhine. Okay, they're going upriver on the Rhine, and here's actually the end of the Rhine, but I think they crossed over here, and then they go down the Danube, and so they're following the rivers, which then lead them. Here's Hungary, through Hungary, and here they cross the border of Hungary, and this is about where Walter Sansevoire would be Semlin, where he would have been, where his men would have been sent naked into the river, right about there. And then they're going to go across here, and we'll follow them on another map later. Okay. Once Walter Sansevoire started pillaging the neighborhood, the commander of Belgrade resorted to arms, and several of Walter's men were killed, and some other of Walter's men were burned alive inside a church. Walter then goes farther eastward to Nish, where he was received by the Byzantine governor Nicetas. And then he proceeds to Constantinople with an escort. And so Walter Sansevoire, with some incidents, ended up having a Byzantine escort to Constantinople. He was the first to arrive. Okay, now here we can see, here's Hungary, and we're going on this route down through Hungary and into Bulgaria. Belgrade is somewhere in here, and then they go down here and finally through Adrianople, and finally they'll end up in Constantinople, and we'll take this up later as they go through Asia Minor. Okay, now, Walter Sansevoire, we have him in Constantinople now. Peter then left Cologne on the 20th of April, and thousands of Germans had joined him by this time. It's estimated that he had 20,000 men and women. He followed the same route that Walter Sansevoire had taken, up the Rhine and down the Danube, and one detachment even traveled by boat, which is a sensible way to go if you're going along a river, safer than walking, I think. They entered Hungary at Odenburg, and there King Koloman warned them that attempts to pillage the countryside would be punished. And so remember that he had been warned by Walter Sansevoire. He's wary of these pilgrims. In late May and early June, Peter the Hermit and his following moved peaceably through Hungary, and in 20 June they reached Semlin, and there they saw the armor of Walter's men hanging on the wall of the city, and so they were immediately suspicious and they were shocked. Meanwhile, just by sheer accident, a dispute arose over a pair of shoes, and over this dispute, a riot ensued, and it turned into a pitched battle. Okay, remember, we're dealing with a rabble. This is just a ragtag group of people. Geoffrey Burrell, who is a minor noble, led an attack on the town of Semlin and captured the citadel, and 4,000 Hungarians were killed. And so then all the pilgrims raced to make haste to cross the river Save. Meanwhile, the Byzantine governor saw this, and he was very alarmed. Okay, he gathered his forces, and what he had were Pechenegs mercenaries. The Pechenegs were a very wild group of tribesmen who had come from Central Asia. We don't even know what what ethnic group or what language they spoke, but they were the most feared of all the savage tribes on the east, on Central Asia. And so Nicetas had a bunch of Pecheneg mercenaries, and he tried to use them as a police force to restrict this rabble that Peter the Hermit had, and to try to get them to cross the river at only one place. Well, the pilgrims resisted. There was a great battle. Several boats were sunk, and several men were put to death. At this point, the army, if you can call it an army, entered Belgrade, and they pillaged it and burned it. On the 3rd of July, Peter the Hermit's pilgrims arrived at Nish, and Peter then asked the governor Nicetas for supplies. Peter was requested to provide hostages. Nicetas was not taking any chances. He was going to hold on to these hostages who would be killed if Peter misbehaved. And so Geoffrey of Burrell and Walter of Breteuil, who were minor nobles, were handed over. I bet they were scared. The local inhabitants then gave the pilgrims food and alms would be money and possessions of various kinds. The next morning, this ragtag mob set out for Sofia in Bulgaria, but some of the quarrelsome Germans set fire to some mills, and Nicetas sent troops to attack the rear guard and take some prisoners. Peter then rushed back to confer with Nicetas. Rumors of fighting and treachery spread through the army, and hotheads attacked the town. Nicetas then unleashed his whole army on them, and the Crusaders were completely routed and scattered, and many of them were slain, many of them were captured. Peter lost his chest of money, and he lost everything. I mean, this was a great disaster. Peter survived. He and Reynold of Bray and Walter of Breteuil and about 500 men fled, and the next morning 7,000 others caught up with them. They continued to pillage the countryside, and they gathered the harvest of a nearby town and kept going, proceeding to Sofia, and many stragglers joined them along the way. On the 12th of July, they reached Sofia, and the emperor's army now, which was keeping a close watch on them, escorted them to Constantinople. And the emperor, now wary that they would pillage the countryside, kept them fully supplied. But the local population was really sympathetic to them, because they talked about their suffering, and the local people, who were all Christians in the Byzantine Empire, gave them money and horses and mules. And the emperor forgave them for their crimes and gave Peter a lot of money. So there's sympathy for them. I don't know what the emperor thought this ragtag mob was going to do, but he was afraid of what they might do to the countryside. The Westerners committed endless thefts, and they broke into the suburban palaces and the villas. And then in Constantinople, they met up with Walter Sansavoir, and they were joined by bands of Italian pilgrims, yet another wave that had come over from Italy. And the emperor was horrified by this mob. I mean, what was he going to do with these people? He had called to the Pope to send him soldiers. He didn't want a mob of these poor people. And so he determined to move them on. And so on the 6th of August, they were all conveyed across the Bosporus, which is that strait of water that separates Asia Minor from Constantinople. And there, once they got into Asia Minor, they started pillaging houses and churches. They marched along the Sea of Marmora, pillaging all the way. Okay, a quarrel broke. Yeah, did you have a question?
Can you describe pillaging? Because, I mean, there's different types, and what I keep thinking
Okay.
is either they're taking all their food, or they're taking all their food and killing the people, or what exactly do you know that they're doing?
They're definitely taking all the food, for sure. They might be taking animals or not. They're definitely killing people. We're already seeing that they're killing people. Pillaging can be anything. It can be malicious burning down of houses, rape, and so, I mean, they're generally raising havoc. And they obviously don't care that they're in a Christian country. Byzantium is Christian. Why are they burning down the lands of all these Christian people? For one thing, they just run amok, They're stealing food, they're living off the land, which is something soldiers do. And so one can understand if they're supplying themselves with food this way, but they're doing malicious plundering. They plunder villas, and so they're helping themselves to wealth. I mean, they're just out of control here. And so the emperor just wants to get rid of them. Meanwhile, a quarrel broke out between the Germans and the Italians against the French, and the Germans and Italians broke away under the command of an Italian named Reynaud. Two factions together proceeded to Civitate. The French were under Geoffrey Borel, and the Germans were under Reynaud, the Italian. And both of them together vied with each other to pillage the countryside, to see who could do the most pillaging. The French sacked the villages and rounded up the flocks and the herds and tortured and killed Christians. And it was even said that they roasted babies on spits, and who knows? I think the Muslims reported that, but it may or may not be true. The Germans, not to be outdone, were said to do the same. They captured the castle of Zeragordon and threatened the entire countryside. So these people are a real menace. Now, as a result, the Seljuk Sultan Kilaj Arslan ibn Suleiman sent a large force to recapture Zeragordon. He surrounded it and took control of the water supply. And there they were, trapped in the castle of Zeragordon. Question?
Yeah, I thought you said this was a Christian country. That doesn't sound like a Christian country.
Once, it actually is. Oh, okay. You want to ask that question again? Maybe the table mic isn't working.
It seems like it's working.
Okay.
Hello, testing.
Testing. Okay. Okay, your question was, does Zeragordon not sound like a Christian name? Okay, remember.
Well, the Arslan ibn Suleiman.
Oh, no, but they have crossed into, let me get to a map. Okay, I've got a map I can show you. All right. Good question. We needed to see a map at this point. Okay, here they are. They're traveling down the Danube. They're going down along here, down the Danube, and they're coming down and crossing here. Here is Constantinople right there, and when they get into this pink part, there's the Sea of Marmara right there. And when they get into this pink part, now the Seljuks have conquered that from the Byzantines. Okay, and this is a Turkish name of the Sultan. Okay, so the Turks are in control, but it's mostly the people who live in this area of Asia Minor, which used to be the Byzantine Empire, are Christians. The majority of the population, in fact, Christians are all in Asia Minor, and also they're the majority of the population in the Holy Land, Greek Orthodox Christians. A good question. I'm glad you cleared that up. Okay, they've crossed the Sea of Marmara, and they're now in this captured Turkish territory. So the Sultan, and we'll call him Arslan, Kilij Arslan is what he's usually called, he sent a large force to recapture Zeragordon and surrounded it and took control of the water supply. So there the Christians were, or the Crusaders were, they were trapped in this castle, besieged, and their water supply was cut off. They grew desperate from thirst. They drank the blood of their horses and donkeys. They even drank urine. They chewed leaves. I mean, they were in desperate situation. And finally, they surrendered, and they were forced to apostatize, which means renounce their faith. Okay, remember that the Turks are new converts. They're very fanatical because they're just newly converted. So the Turks forced them either to convert to Islam, and then when they converted, they were sold into slavery. Okay, and anybody who wouldn't convert was killed. Okay. Now, so there's the end of Peter's mob. I mean, they're gone at this point. They're either slaves or they're dead. The Turks then spread a false rumor at Civitate that the Germans had taken Nicaea, and the remainder of the Crusaders rushed to the roads to Nicaea, and there the Sultan ambushed them, and panicked. The Crusaders returned to Civitate. Responsible leaders urged awaiting Peter the Hermit's return from Constantinople, because Peter had gone to Constantinople to ask for help. The responsible leaders were Walter Saint-Sauveur, Reynald of Bray, Walter of Breteuil, and Fulk of Orleans. But Geoffrey Burrell hot-headedly led the army out to avenge Zara-Gordon, and the Crusaders marched noisily and carelessly, and once again the Turks ambushed them with a weapon that the Crusaders were not used to, that they weren't warriors anyway, because remember there are bunches of women and children along with them. But the Turks had a way of fighting that they weren't used to in the West, and this was to gallop up with armed archers. First, a wave of armed archers would gallop up on horseback, shooting their arrows and raining arrows down on them, and then the archers would sort of separate, and they would make way, and then behind them would come the swordsmen. The cavalry was swordsmen, and so it was a different style of fighting. It was a different way of fighting that the Crusaders weren't used to. Also, they frequently ambushed people, and because this was very hilly and mountainous country, they were just masters at luring them into a trap and then ambushing them, and so this is what happened. And panic seized the cavalry. The whole army fled in utter disorder to Civitot, and only the women and children and old men were left, and the Turks mercilessly massacred every one of them. The soldiers, the women, the priests were massacred before they had time to move, and the only people who were spared were young boys and girls who were beautiful or attractive enough to please the Turks, and they were enslaved. Remember that I mentioned when I talked about Islam that slavery is not condemned in Islam, that throughout the history of Islam there's always constant slavery going on. It's a part of that culture. And so there's no slavery, not much slavery in Western Europe, because Christianity mitigated against it, and there was preaching against slavery in Western Europe. Yeah, question?
Hopefully this is working. When I got to that point in the reading about the archers, I was kind of wondering, was it the fact that the archers were mounted that scared them, or was it because that they didn't have much military experience with the people that were going into battle there?
You know, it was...
Archers were around.
Yeah.
But I wanted to know what was the scaring element there.
I think it was the archers on horseback and the unfamiliar military tactics, because remember I've sort of stressed that war had become almost a formal ritual in Europe. It was very ritualized, and they had a certain way of fighting that everybody followed. I mean, it was like a game, and you follow the rules. And the Turks had a different style, and it just really alarmed them. And also remember that the rabble, you have some lesser noblemen who would have been knights and had some military experience, but most of them were a rabble of lower class and middle class people that weren't military.
Yeah, the only reason why I ask is because the lesser nobility at that time would have supposedly been well educated in more ancient techniques using archery and things like that. So I would have thought that, I don't know, maybe there wasn't much training. I have no idea what that actually involved for the peasants, but that at least the leaders of the military force would have been somewhat prepared for an archery attack, because it was considered honorable to be well versed in ancient techniques and things like that.
Yeah, which is true. Usually the archers in Western armies were foot soldiers who would rain their arrows from, well, they might sort of rain their arrows on them to soften them up, but they weren't a major part of the battle. It was the cavalry, men that fought on horseback. But then the Turks fought on horseback too, and they were much more lightly armored than the Westerners were. The Westerners had the heavy chain-link mail. The Turks had more of a leather kind of armor on them. So I mean, it was so different. And they were so provincial. Yeah, did you have a question?
Yes. Also, in reading the First Crusade book, when they were fighting the Turks, that at night he wrote that they couldn't do anything, but they would lower hooks down and pick up armor off the ground from their dead comrades, because obviously these Arabs didn't have the armor. I mean, they would lower down ropes and hooks and take the armor from them.
Yes, they would. If the knights had fallen outside the city, outside the walls of the city, they would lower hooks to take their armor. Armor was enormously valuable. Metal was, and the armor was valuable too. And so that was that's why the lesser knights are called lesser knights, because they didn't have as good armor, and the archers would have been even lower on the social scale and less wealthy, and so they might not have had any armor at all, whereas the archers were featured in the Turkish army. Yeah, question?
Also the Central Asian bow before the British longbow, before they started using the British longbow, the Arabic bow was reflex bow. It's much stronger. It had a lot greater range than the bow that the French were using.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah. Weren't they smaller? Would they have smaller bows?
They were smaller, but they were 4 times reinforced, and
okay.
They could shoot much further, and they were much more powerful.
Yeah. The bow was a major element of their system, whereas it was very minor, a side element of the Western army. So that's one difference between it. Well, after this disaster, 3,000 refugees reached an old castle by the sea, and corpses littered the shore from the pass of Drakon to the shore. A Greek managed to escape to Constantinople with the news, and the Byzantines came and rescued the people in the castle. But by this time, you know, Peter the Hermit's army was totally a disaster. Everybody was killed or enslaved, and they didn't accomplish a thing. I mean, they really fell by the wayside. At this point, let's go back and let's look at the second wave that comes along. And remember, these are major waves, and that there are lesser waves coming in between them all. Okay, going back to the second wave, Peter the Hermit's disciple, Gottschalk, was left behind in Germany to collect an army. Colonies of Jews were established all along the trade routes leading east, and so the Jews, of course, being major moneylenders and merchants, were along the trade routes, and they were growing increasingly unpopular as the cash economy of Europe was growing. As prosperity rose in Europe and towns arose, there was more and more animosity toward the Jews, because now Europeans, or Christian Europeans, were competing with the Jews for the same kind of business economy. And so there was more resentment growing. Already in the Spanish wars in Spain, there had been some mistreatment of the Jews. And an interesting phenomenon that I've run across in my research was that in Normandy, St. Anselm's students were all writing tracts against the Jews. And this is kind of interesting, because St. Anselm is revered as this just incredibly holy saint who proved the existence of God through human reason alone. And when you look at what his students were doing, almost every one of them wrote a tract against the Jews. Anselm himself wrote a tract against the Greeks. And I don't know why. It seems that around the year 1000 that this animosity starts growing against the Jews, and it grows all of a sudden, and nobody really knows why, except maybe it's the competition for the merchant economy. Here are some Jews. This particular caption of this picture says it's a conspiracy of the Jews in France, and of course the Christian writer is imagining that the Jews are conspiring to do something evil and wrong. In December 1095, the French Jews wrote to warn the German Jews of trouble from the crusade. There are reports of the massacre of Jews at Rouen in Normandy. Rouen is the capital of Normandy. Probably that's untrue. There are no records of a real massacre of the Jews. However, King William Rufus of England, who was the son of William the Conqueror, was criticized for protecting his Jews. And there's a major work that criticizes him very heavily for allowing Jews who had been forced to convert to Christianity to return to their Judaism. In other words, this tract argues that he's soft on Jews. You know, he doesn't make them stay converted to Christianity. Interestingly, that particular work that I'm quoting was written by one of Anselm's students that is accusing, and the church hated William Rufus because he sort of collected all the money from the churches. But here this is sort of tied into the whole movement against the Jews. Peter the Hermit had coerced German Jews to provision his so-called army. And at about the same time, Godfrey of Bouillon began preparations for the crusade. And Godfrey of Bouillon is going to emerge as the greatest hero of the Crusades. He'll emerge as the legendary hero of the First Crusade, and just his myths are blown all out of proportion to what he actually did. Rumors spread throughout Germany that he would persecute the Jews, and the German Jews wrote to the Emperor Henry IV, who forbade this. And to be safe, the Jews of Mainz and Cologne each offered Godfrey 500 pieces of silver, and Godfrey took it. And so there's a sense of coercion going on here, that of a threat, pay us your money or we'll attack you. The Emperor Henry IV wrote to his chief vassals, lay and ecclesiastic, and guaranteed the protection of the Jews. And at this time, Godfrey, now with the cash in hand, gladly agreed. So he obeyed after he had taken all the Jews' money. We'll come back to Godfrey of Bouillon, and we'll look at his background a little later. In April 1096, a certain Volkmar, with 10,000 men, set out to join Peter the Hermit. He also took the road to Hungary through Bohemia. And a few days later, Gottschalk left along Peter's route and again up the Rhine and down the Danube, that same route that we went before with Walter Saint-Sauveur. At the same time, Count Emich of Lessingen left on his way to the Holy Land with a much larger force of peasants, lots and lots of simple peasants and members of the German nobility. On the 3rd of May, all of this rabble ignored Henry's orders and attacked the Jews at Speyer. Now, all along the route, when you look at what's happening here, the bishops and the archbishops and the priests are actually protecting these Jews. They're obeying the emperor, and they're obeying the Pope. The Pope as well argued that they should not, that these crusaders should not attack the Jews. The Bishop of Speyer placed Jews under his protection, but 12 Jews were slain by crusaders after refusing to convert, and one woman committed suicide to preserve her virtue. Now, does anybody have any comments about, we had a lot of things to read in our collection of primary sources, a lot of chronicles from the Jews. What did you think about that, those Jewish first-hand accounts of the persecution? Any comments? Go ahead. Yeah.
Is this working? It seems, especially taking a look at other sources in history, if having reading this in retrospect, it seems same story, different day.
Yeah. Yeah, they're all very much alike, and you just see the same thing happening over and over and over again. It's just a brutal. Yeah. Did you want to make a comment?
Yes, ma'am. I just had a question in that the monks or Absalom's saying of Absalom's students who criticized William Rufus, who was very unpopular in England for leaving open the bishopship so he could collect the money and stuff.
Right.
Was that maybe like propaganda because he was so unpopular, and they were trying to build up the Queen Act reform and all that?
Probably so. It was propaganda against William Rufus, but it's important to look at what propaganda they chose, what accusations they chose to make against him. What they did, you read this one tract, which is, it's really a biography of Anselm, and it's condemning William Rufus, and they accused him of looting the church, they accused him of loving the Jews, and they accused him of being homosexual. Okay, those were the big accusations they made against him. The worst things they could possibly think of, the absolute worst, they accused him of being an atheist. Okay, that's another thing they accused him of. They were making against him all the worst accusations they could think of, and those were the worst they came up with. And so probably there was a lot of propaganda to it. I mean, I can't believe that anyone could be an atheist in the culture of Western Europe. I mean, I think it would be impossible. But there they accused him of it. Yeah.
I was just wondering if, propaganda like that may be politically motivated or, would have a effect on the lady and, help them harbor ill feelings toward the Jews.
It would have an effect on the people. Yeah, it would increase it, and that's interesting that you bring that up too, because this particular manuscript that accuses him of this. Oh wait, I'm trying to remember. There are two lives of Saint Anselm. One is the life of Anselm that is more of a biography of his monasticism. The other is his political career of Archbishop of Canterbury. I think that actually appears more in the Historia Novorum, which didn't have a wide circulation. The other one, the Vita Anselmi, which is the life story, had a huge circulation. I think everybody in Europe had read it. I mean, there were so many hundreds of manuscripts of it that survive to this day. That means that lots of people had read it. It was a bestseller. Okay, but I think both of them actually accuse him of loving the Jews. I'll look that up for you and see which one. I know the Historia Novorum stresses it more than the Vita Anselmi does. But I had a feeling, it was really interesting to read all those first-hand accounts of the persecutions of the Jews. I had a feeling he could have put a few less in there. They were a little bit repetitive, but it's interesting that there were so many accounts, that the Jews were writing so many accounts. Really, they're eyewitness accounts. Yeah, did you have a comment?
There was, in several of the accounts, it talked about the Jewish people taunting the Christians, calling Christ a trampled corpse and son of lust and son of menstruation. And I don't know whether to discount that, because the historical evidence seems to prove that they were already scared.
Yeah.
So why would they be taunting a force superior in numbers?
Okay, I don't know which one you're referring to, but there are some Christian sources in there, like Arnold of Aix, and there are also some Jewish sources, and I'll bet you that's in the Christian source. And what it is a justifying of why they're persecuting the Jews, because the Jews are, blaspheming Christ, and so. Yeah, did you have a comment?
I was going to say, I wondered if they were writing also letters saying, these crusaders are coming in your area, so you might want to consider either fleeing or, because it astounded me how a lot of them did, it's called Kiddush Hashem, which is ritual sacrifice, killing yourself. Mm-hmm. And it's, in Jewish law, it's not really widely practiced. It seemed like there had to have been letters written saying, you might want to consider this if you can't, flee or leave your country, because they were peasants. They were on the land. They couldn't leave. And so I was wondering if maybe that was also written in some of those letters, if that was one of their options, because in Jewish law it's not highly recommended that you do that.
Right, it's not. They were getting letters, to answer your question. The French Jews were writing letters to the Germans and saying, watch out, the Crusaders are coming and they're doing anti-Jewish things. The other thing is, one thing that is quite interesting is in those accounts, as you look at the eyewitness accounts, often they'll say that the townsmen joined the Crusaders, and the townsmen would have been merchants. They would have been tradesmen and merchants who would have been in competition with the Jews for economic success. And so that was interesting, I thought, to see how the tradesmen always allied themselves with the Crusaders to help persecute the Jews and take their money. Yeah, but all the Crusaders wanted was their money. So
I was going to say, I was reading a book on Spain and how there was one act, I don't remember, it was in Cordoba, but one city in Spain where they had a riot against the Jews, and then even the common people started getting involved, and then the merchants started getting involved, and then everybody started getting involved, and if you looked like a Jew, or if you even even had a perceived notion that you were a Jew, just because you had money in your hand, you were killed. And they had to have the king forcibly come in and stop it and kill some of the people that were doing the riots, because it was just over anything. If you had money in your hand, you were a Jew. It didn't matter what you were.
Well, when the people's passions are inflamed, terrible things happen. But I thought those sources were very interesting. Another comment we might make about the sources are Urban's letters that are in here. And remember all the people he wrote to, and he wrote to monks in the monastery and said, stay in your monastery. I don't want you to go to the Holy Land. And he said, I intend for knights to go. I don't intend for the common people. And so, this is like the theory of unintended consequences. Things got out of control, and that wasn't what he planned. He didn't plan on these mobs going, and he didn't plan on the Jews being persecuted. But this is what happened. I mean, so we've got all of these Jews being slain on the way to the Holy Land. Okay, let's see if we can get finished in time. The bishop captured several murderers and cut off their hands. Okay, that's an interesting punishment that I haven't run across in Europe before. So that, it's like violence is reaching new heights in Europe. On 18 May, Emek arrived at Worms, and there was a rumor there circulating that the Jews had poisoned the wells. The townsfolk and the peasants joined Emek in attacking the Jewish quarter, and all the Jews were captured and killed. The bishop opened his palace to the Jewish refugees, but Emek broke down the doors and killed all 500 Jews inside. Now Emek continued his path of persecution. On 25 May, he arrived at Mainz and found the city gates closed against him by order of the archbishop. But the following day, some friends opened the city gates to him, and the Jews assembled at the synagogue sent 200 marks of silver to the archbishop and the mayor, asking to be taken into their respective palaces. The Jews thought if they paid enough and gave it to the archbishop and the mayor, they would be protected. Well, and here are some Jews the Jews of Cologne actually being burned alive. So this is a picture from a medieval manuscript that shows the persecution of the Jews. At the same time, a Jewish emissary gave Emek 7 pounds of gold to spare them, and the next day, of course, the archbishop and the mayor let the Jews into their palaces, and the next day Emek attacked the archbishop's palace. The archbishop fled, and the Jews were overcome and slain. The massacre, in fact, lasted 3 days, and about 1,000 perished. Emek now set out for Cologne, and there the Jews, having heard the story of Mainz, fled into the countryside, hiding out in villages. Emek burned the synagogue in Cologne. And early in June, Emek decided his work was done, but a large party of his followers thought the Moselle Valley should also be purged. And so on the 1st of June, they arrived at Trier. At Trier, the Jews were sheltered by the archbishop, but they fought among themselves, and some of them threw themselves into the Moselle and drowned. And so this might be what you were talking about in the sort of doing away with themselves because of the Crusaders coming. Emek then moved on to Metz, where he killed 22 Jews, and in June he returned to Cologne, hoping to rejoin. These were his followers who returned to Cologne, helping to rejoin Emek. And finding him gone, they proceeded down the Rhine, that same route that they're going, down the Rhine and up the Rhine and down the Danube. In 24 to 27 June, they massacred the Jews at Neuss, Webelinghofen, Eller, and Xanten. Then they dispersed, some returning home and others merging with the army of Godfrey of Boulogne that was also traveling the same route. Well, news of Emek's exploits reached others. Volkmar and his followers arrived at Prague in modern Czechoslovakia at the end of May, and in 30 June they began to massacre the Jews in Prague. Again, the bishops protested and tried to protect the Jews, and again the Crusaders ignored what the bishops were saying. At Nitra in Hungary, Volkmar and his followers tried to massacre the Jews, and the Hungarians stopped them. And at this point, the Hungarians attacked and scattered the Crusaders, and their fates are unknown. They just disappeared. They were sold into slavery, they were killed, they ran away. We don't know what happened to them. Meanwhile, Gottschalk, also having heard of the massacre of Jews, decided that he would massacre Jews too at Ratisbon in Bavaria. And when he entered Hungary, he began to pillage the countryside. And once again, the peasants resisted. And during this melee, the Crusaders impaled a young Hungarian boy. And when this happened, the Hungarians were absolutely livid with rage, and the Hungarian army massacred Gottschalk and all his followers. Okay. So now we've already got Peter the Hermit's army completely massacred. And now we've got these other armies following, Gottschalk's and Volkmar's, all massacred. A few weeks later, Emmeck's army approached the Hungarian frontier. And by this time, King Kalaman was really upset when any crusaders came to his borders. King Kalaman was alarmed at the large size of the army and refused them permission to pass through his kingdom. For 6 weeks, Emmeck's army fought Hungarians at the bridge across the river, and Emmeck's army couldn't get past the Hungarians, so they built themselves an alternative bridge, and meanwhile they were pillaging the entire countryside. At last they crossed the bridge and laid siege to the castle of Wisselburg. Their siege engines were so good that the fall of the town seemed imminent. But the Crusader army, and this is Emmeck's army, panicked at a rumor that the king's army was coming, and the town garrison fell on Emmeck's army, and Emmeck was routed utterly. So Emmeck's crusade collapsed, as had Volkmar's and Gottschalk's, and really most of Peter the Hermit's had also collapsed. And to most good Christians, it appeared as God's punishment to them for killing the Jews. Okay, we have a few minutes for discussion before we take our break. Anybody want to make any comments about this? Yeah.
It's not really a discussion point, but just kind of curiosity. You mentioned that the Middle East Christians, or the Christians that were in the Middle East, were mostly Greek Orthodox.
Yes.
At what point did the Eastern Orthodox split occur? Where they started breaking up the Greek Orthodox Church?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. You know, they sort of, starting all the way back in the time of the reign of Justinian, they're splitting and they come together, and they split and they come together because while the theory of the Pope of Rome being separate and different from the Eastern Church was growing, you see, in Western Europe, there was only one patriarch, one disciple of Christ went there, that was Peter. And so you have the Patriarch of Rome, who is the Pope, in the West. All the other cities are in the East. So you have lots of patriarchs in the East. You have 11 other ones. I mean, you have one at Antioch, you have one at Nicaea, you have one at Alexandria, you have one in Constantinople. And so a concept of a pope doesn't arise in the East. The Patriarch of Constantinople is like a partner ruling with the Byzantine emperor, but he has equals, like the Patriarch of Jerusalem is his equal, the Patriarch of Antioch is his equal, the Patriarch of Alexandria is his equal. And so there's a widening, a split between the culture. The culture in the West is growing a lot different than the culture in the East. But the Western popes still might send somebody there to learn something or to bargain with the emperor. For example, Pope Gregory I, who is regarded as the founder of the medieval church in Europe, in the West, he spent about 14 years in Constantinople before he became pope, as an ambassador for his predecessor, the other pope. And so he learned a lot from them. But he's considered the founder of the medieval papacy because he turns westward and he turns his back on the East and builds the church in the West, mostly by converting England and concentrating on France. And so there's another place where the gulf is widening and widening. And then in 1054, there's a split between them, which has to do with the Reformed papacy arising in the West. And Gregory VII is preaching against them. Now it's getting heated up. And so this is another part of the crusade. But then think of their motives for going to the Holy Land. Why did they go? To rescue the Christians in the East. So the split hasn't completely happened even then. I mean, they're aware of the differences. And I mentioned Anselm, who wrote a tract against the Greeks, and he wrote it in 1097 while the crusade was going on. So it's an ongoing process. And really, I would say the break comes when the Crusaders conquer Constantinople in the Fourth Crusade. What did you think?
By the same token, didn't the Crusaders also go and kill Eastern Orthodoxers? Or,
They did. They
or
did.
Was that during the First Crusade, or was that during a later one?
When we look at the third wave, when the nobles go and they actually get into the Holy Land, because remember, none of these guys have. I mean, they've gotten into Asia Minor, but nobody's gotten to the Holy Land yet. They all got stopped when they got to Asia Minor. And when they actually get into the Holy Land, as we look at the third wave, which is the Prince's Crusade, they eventually kill as many Christians as they do Jews and Muslims. I mean, when we get to the end of the story of the First Crusade, they're slaughtering everybody, indiscriminately. But we'll talk about why they do that. I mean, there are reasons why they do that. And it doesn't have anything to do with a break with the Greek Orthodox Church. It has more to do with the psychology of war, just the brutalizing that war causes. And we're going to go through, after the break, we'll go through the Prince's Crusade, the successful wave of the First Crusade. We'll go through it pretty much point by point. And it's just incredible what they go through. I mean, it's astonishing. The whole thing is you wouldn't believe it if it hadn't really happened and so many witnesses hadn't told the story. It's really hard to believe that such a thing could happen. But it's such a... No wonder. I mean, when you see the experiences all these people had, and they're just amazing. We've already talked about just mind-boggling things, the slaughtering of the Jews and these just crowds of people walking into the wilderness without any maps, without knowing where they're going, led by these fanatics, and they don't know where they're going, and they don't know how to get there, and they don't have any food with them. Most of them don't have any money with them, and they're just setting out into the unknown, and that is, I mean, it's hard to believe that could happen. It's just an amazing phenomenon. Any of you have any ideas about that from reading our sources? I mean, when you look at what was happening in Europe before then, it's just such an anomaly. It's so different than anything the Europeans had done before. And I said they're so tradition bound. Remember, they look to the past for their models. They don't like to innovate. They like to recreate the past. They like to follow the models of the past. And then to see them doing these really strange and bizarre things is quite a puzzle, about why they're doing it. Anybody had any thoughts about, or do you want to think about it a week and come back and discuss it next week? You have a comment?
Well, I was just going to say it's interesting to kind of see how in studying like English history at that time, also they were very tradition bound, like you said, and how people, they kind of made up things in tradition within tradition to further their goals. So I think that kind of helps explain it, like the Normans' conquest of and how English kings kept harping back to when they were also the kings of Normandy, and push that up into the 100 Years' War. And I think this is something similar could have occurred here, where they're not. There's no tradition of it, but there's a tradition, like you were saying, the rumors or the legend of Charlemagne, and so things like that. They grandized, and this war is being fought by the elite classes, so they kind of have a little different culture than everybody else also.
Yeah, and I guess if you want to think about how many people are educated at this time and would know those traditions, in 1097, education is just taking off. There are a lot of monks, of course, are educated. Some ordinary people are educated. Some knights and some noble people are educated, but by no means the majority are educated. And what they would know would be more by word of mouth than by having an actual education. But they would probably know all these Bible verses that you mentioned. Who mentioned that you mentioned that they were? No, it was Jonathan who mentioned that the Bible verses were so prevalent in the stories here, in the Chronicles that we read. So they would know their Bible, and they would recognize the Bible verses. Yeah, we have 24 seconds till we take our break. You want to wait until after the break? Okay, we'll start with your question when we come back from the break, and we'll look at the third wave of Crusaders and the successful ones who actually conquered the Holy Land.